Fellas, we've just had UFC Vegas 102 with Cannonier absolutely butchering Gregory Rodrigues in that 4th round, getting the KO after surviving an early onslaught. So we're going to be doing a bit of a recap of the card. It was a pretty good card on paper. It was quite stacked for an Apex card, and there was a lot of good moments to come from this card, which we are going to recap. Starting off with the first fight on the card, we had Avila taking on Jacquelin Cavelcanti, where Jacquelin Cavelcanti essentially just completely outstruck Avila for the majority of the fight. Pieced her up on the feet. Avila couldn't really get going, and eventually Cavelcanti, without surprise, gets her, I think, 4th decision win in the UFC. She's got no finishing ability, but my main takeaways from this fight is that Cavelcanti is a solid kickboxer. I'm not going to call her a prospect or anything, but she's a pretty solid kickboxer. I know she's facing Avila, who's been out for a few years and was never really known for her technique. She was mainly known for her toughness, but yeah, Cavelcanti is a good kickboxer, quick, snappy, trains at a good team as well. But she doesn't have any finishing ability. I mean, how many decisions is that in a row? I think it's 4 decisions in a row. 2 of them are split decisions as well. And I think there's a lot of moments to go out there and get the finish over Avila. But then I will say that Avila's tough. And I feel like retirement was a good decision for Avila. She's very inactive. She fights on average once a year. She was a huge underdog coming into this fight. And like I said, very tough, isn't going to give up. She likes to put on the pressure, but she's just not there from a skills perspective. I mean, being ranked in the women's bantamweight division doesn't really mean anything either, considering there's about 20 women's bantamweights on the entire roster. But yeah, good performance from Cavelcanti. I say we give her a step up in competition, somebody in the top 7, maybe even if somebody in the top 5, considering she's undefeated in the UFC. But that was a good performance from Cavelcanti. Definitely give her somebody in the top 10. And like I said, considering how uncompetitive the women's bantamweight division is, I'm not surprised she gets a big fight and wins it. But good fight overall. Avila came back at one point. Well, she didn't really make a comeback, but she fought back and at least made an attempt to turn the fight in her favour. Never really got it, but Cavelcanti pieces her up and gets a decision win. Next on the card, we had a heavyweight clash between Don'Tale Mayes, who somehow made it into the rankings. I still don't know how that happened. Taking on the brother of Johnny Walker in Valter Walker, and effortlessly, Valter Walker submits him in the first round, charges at him within the first 10 seconds, takes him down, and within 30 seconds, he's found the heel hook and submitted Don'Tale Mayes. My main takeaways from this fight is that this is an amazing win from Valter Walker. I know he was kind of mocked early on in his UFC career, losing to the likes of Lucas Brzeski, but he's definitely made a comeback. 2 wins in a row now, 2 finishes by heel hook as well. And this just proves that all it takes in the heavyweight division is a double leg takedown. In every other weight class, you've got to be well rounded. At heavyweight, all it takes is a double leg takedown, and you're basically making it into the top 15. I'd like to see Valter Walker. I'm not saying this should be his next fight, but I'd like to see him against another grappler like a Sergey Spivak or maybe even like a Shamil Gaziev, because heavyweight's got a lot of grapplers now in the top 15, the likes of Gaziev, Spivak, Marcin Tybura, Valter Walker. I think there's a lot of good matchups for Valter Walker. He seems to have a bit of personality as well, unlike a lot of the heavyweights as well, so it looks like he's a bit of a heavyweight. I'm not going to call him a prospect. I can't call everyone a prospect, but he looks like he's a guy who could potentially make a name for himself in the heavyweight division. And I'm assuming that Don'Tale Mayes is probably going to be cut from the UFC. You know, he's a bit of a win-loss fighter. I know he was ranked, but we just had Rozenstruik getting cut from the UFC. Don'Tale Mayes, 2 losses in a row. Now he's just been finished by Valter Walker. Won't surprise me if Don'Tale Mayes gets cut from the UFC, but flawless win by Valter Walker. He actually seems like a bit of a promising guy in the heavyweight division. He's got personality. He's a really good grappler. He seems to be getting more experience. I don't know how good his stand-up is, considering he hasn't really tested it in the UFC, but all I can say is that was a good win by Valter Walker. Made it easy as I thought he would. Gets the submission over Don'Tale Mayes. Cut Don'Tale Mayes from the UFC, and let's see Valter Walker versus Sergey Spivak. Good performance from Valter Walker. Then we had Vince Morales versus Elijah Smith. Another really good fight. I was kind of nervous at the beginning of this fight after I picked Elijah Smith, because when you really think about it, Vince Morales, he's had a lot of fights in the UFC, way more experience, and he's only really lost to good fighters, and Elijah Smith did look gassed in his contenders in his fight, but it was a nice back and forth fight. A lot of times Elijah Smith was in trouble with the grappling of Vince Morales, but he was able to pull through and eventually get the win. My main takeaways is that it was a horrible start to the fight. I mean, in that first round, I think it was like the first half of the first round, there were 2 illegal blows. Eventually, Vince Morales hit a massive groin shot on Elijah Smith, leaving him out for like 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes. I actually thought the fight was going to be stopped from how much pain Smith was in. And then pretty much a minute after he recovers, he then goes and eye pokes Vince Morales to make it a pretty chaotic start to the first round. But there was non-stop grappling reversals in this fight. Elijah Smith would take down Vince Morales. Vince Morales would threat the Darce choke, and you'd think he's about to submit him. I mean, in the last 10 seconds of the fight, I actually thought Elijah Smith could go to sleep or at least tap, because Vince Morales had him in such a tight, I think it was a rear naked choke or a face crank. But this was just non-stop grappling reversals, but this was a banging fight overall. They were both coming forward. They both looked like they wanted to win. They both had their moments in the fight. They both looked like they could turn it in their favor. You'd think that 1 minute Vince Morales was going to get a submission, then you think that Elijah Smith is going to knock him out. But it was a great debut for Elijah Smith. He's got pretty solid striking, pretty good grappling too. I'd say the only place he lacks is defensively everywhere. His defensive stand-up isn't that good. He kind of just runs against the cage, and when it comes to defensive grappling, he was put in a bunch of bad positions by Vince Morales, who's probably going to get cut from the UFC after this, or maybe isn't going to get given a big fight. But it was a good fight overall. I liked it. Apart from the first round, good win for Elijah Smith. Looks quite kind of promising. Again, I'm not going to keep throwing around the term prospect just because he's from Contender Series, but it was a good fight and good performance from Elijah Smith. Then we had Gabriel Bonfim versus Khaos Williams. I kind of knew this fight was good. I think I picked Bonfim to win this one by decision, but this was one of them that I wouldn't bet on a method of victory considering how dangerous both of them are. Bonfim has a flawless performance and gets the submission in the second round, putting Khaos Williams out cold when there's about 5 seconds left. Yeah, gets the submission with seconds left. I think there was genuinely like under 5 seconds left at the time of the submission. If Khaos Williams would have just survived an extra 10 seconds, he probably would have made it into the third round. But Gabriel Bonfim looked very dominant in this fight. He looked amazing. I mean, he was out striking Khaos Williams by a large margin. Khaos Williams couldn't really land anything significant. It was just Gabriel Bonfim piecing him up for the first round, piecing him up for the second round, and then eventually takes him down and uses his submission ability to get the submission over Khaos Williams and puts him out cold, puts him to sleep, and chokes him unconscious. And I feel like Gabriel Bonfim, I know he got finished by Nicolas Dalbe, but that's his only professional loss. He's got really good striking, really good grappling. I also think he's ranked potential in the middle welterweight division is Gabriel Bonfim. I'm not saying he deserves to get somebody in the rankings next, but I feel like he's at that skill level now because of how well-rounded he is. And Khaos Williams, he's dangerous. He's got a short average fight time, but he's a bit of a power merchant. Like, he fights once a year on average. He's a very hard-hitting guy, very dangerous, but apart from that, he kind of proved in this fight that he's a bit of a power merchant. Doesn't really have the best technique, doesn't really have the best gas tank. He's also had a couple of losses in the UFC, and now he's just been choked to sleep by Gabriel Bonfim, but it was a good performance by Bonfim. Looked very dominant. I'm not sure who we give him next. I'd love to see him against like a Rinat Fakhretdinov. I think he was actually supposed to fight Rinat on this card, so I'd love to see that fight, and if not, maybe just give Gabriel Bonfim somebody in the welterweight rankings. I don't know who we can give him. Maybe somebody coming off a loss, maybe like a... I don't know, just anyone in the welterweight rankings I think would make sense for Bonfim next, but solid performance, very well-rounded. And we'll talk about his brother as well later on in the card with Ismael Bonfim as well, and we'll get in there with the next fight, which was Rafael Estevam versus Jesus Aguilar. I know it's not how you pronounce it, Jesus, but I'm going to call him Jesus anyway. Anyway, Estevam gets a good decision win over Aguilar, essentially just out-grappling him for the majority of the fight. There was nothing significant going on. Out-grappled him for the first 2 rounds. He did look like he was in a bit of trouble in that third round, looked a bit gassed out, and Aguilar was landing the bigger shots, but Estevam picks up a decision win, as I thought, with the dominant grappling exchanges. It was a fairly fun dogfight because they both had their moments. I say Aguilar was definitely doing the better on the feet. Estevam was definitely doing the better with the grappling. Aguilar probably had the biggest submission threat as well. He kept going for guillotines in this fight. It was like watching Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint-Denis Part 2. So yeah, the grappling exchanges were quite fun. Very back and forth because, like I said, the submission threat from Aguilar, the wrestling from Estevam. But I think it's at the point now where we give Rafael Estevam somebody in the rankings. He's 13-0 now, undefeated, 2-0 in the UFC, and one of his wins are over Charles Johnson, and I think Charles Johnson is like number 12 in the division as well, so we've got to give Rafael Estevam somebody in the rankings, in my opinion, of the flyweight division. He's just earned that against Aguilar. And he's a solid grappling prospect. I'm not saying he's like the next big thing in the flyweight division because, like I said, his stamina was definitely lacking. He looked completely gassed out in that third round, which I don't blame him because he was dominating Aguilar with the grappling for the first 2 rounds. And Aguilar still looks talented, maybe not ready for the rankings just yet. I think him versus like a Clayton Carpenter could be an absolute banger of a fight. I think that's probably the fight to make next for Aguilar, and I'm not sure who you make next for Estevam. Maybe if you're going to give him somebody highly ranked like a Tim Elliott maybe, but yeah, get Estevam in the rankings, get a number next to his name, get him a ranked and assigned fight in the rankings because he's a solid grappling prospect, does need to improve his stamina. Would be good to see him improve his stand-up, but overall, solid performance, dominates Aguilar with the wrestling as I expected him to. Then we had Angela Hill versus Ketlen Souza. I think this was the first fight I got wrong on the predictions, I think. I think it was anyway. Anyway, Angela Hill gets a decision win over Ketlen Souza. She looked really good in the first round, kind of slowed down in the second, and then got back to it in the third. She was essentially just out-wrestling her in the first round, and I don't want to say piecing her up, but she was definitely out-striking her in the third round. Hill's still improving at 40 years old. There's not really much I can say about this fight, but to say that Angela Hill's a 40-year-old woman and she's still improving, it's kind of, you know, good to see, because she was out wrestling Souza in this fight, which isn't something I expected to see. Solid performance from Angela Hill for 40 years old, looked pretty good, and it was a decent scrap. There was probably, I don't think there was a single 10 seconds in this entire fight where one of them wouldn't land a significant strike. Angela Hill was the one pressuring. Ketlen Souza probably landed the more damaging, the more significant shots, but Angela Hill beat you with the output and the wrestling. Not really much to say from this fight. Good win for Angela Hill. Looks good. I'm not going to say she needs to retire as well, but just because she's 40 years old, because she did look good in this fight. And for Ketlen Souza, I didn't really understand the game plan. I was expecting a bit more pressure and a bit more grappling offense, because that would be the game plan to beat Angela Hill, but women MMA, what can I say? Next fight we had was Jose Delgado versus Conor Matthews, where Delgado gets the knockout in the very first round over Conor Matthews. And yeah, that's all there is really to say. A lot of spinning attacks from Jose Delgado in this fight, and gets the knockout. Great win for Delgado. That's my main takeaway from this fight. It was a great win from him. He's a crafty striker as well. Even if you look at him in the Contender Series, he's out there throwing flying knees, spinning attacks. Looks very crafty on the feet, but he's also a very dangerous striker. I think every single one of his fights, or every single one of his wins, come by way of finish as well. So he's a very dangerous guy, and he's somebody that you have to look up for in this, I think, is the lightweight division. And he's got a good team around us as well, training with the likes of Benson Henderson, and he's only like 8 and I think he's like 9-1 in the UFC now. He's a potential prospect. Looks like he's a promising guy. Said that he's a future champion, and it's good when we see these guys on the mic who seem like they're actually motivated to go out there and get a win. I know it's a very generic thing to say, but Jose Delgado looked very motivated in his Octagon interview, and he keeps having these good performances. Just went out there and knocked out Conor Matthews, and yeah, solid performance. Now, in terms of Conor Matthews, I don't think he's going to get cut from the UFC, but he's at that stage now where I think he's like 7-5 in his professional career. He's taken 2 knockout losses in a row. I don't actually think he's won in the UFC as of yet, so he probably is going to get cut from the UFC, which is a shame because he's also fairly dangerous. But good run from Delgado, gets the knockout as I expected, and I kind of want to see what he does next. Then we had Rodolfo Viera taking on Andre Petroski. Now, we knew this was going to go one of two ways. It was either going to be an extremely heavy grappling matchup, similar to like Rafael, Estevam, and Aguilar, where you put 2 grapplers against each other, or it's going to cancel out and become a bit of a stand-up fight. Rodolfo Viera tried making it into a grappling fight, but Andre Petroski kept the fight on the feet and essentially just outstruck and pieced up Rodolfo Viera. I think he defended like nearly every single takedown against Rodolfo Viera as well. So Petroski gets a good win, gets the decision win over Rodolfo Viera, a dangerous middleweight, and it was a good performance. My main summary and takeaway from this fight is that it was a great game plan from Andre Petroski, keeping the fight on the feet with solid takedown defense. He's a really good wrestler, is Petroski. Kept the fight standing and did what he needed to do, just pieced up Rodolfo Viera. Didn't get greedy and end up falling into a takedown, in which he would have been in a very dangerous position with Rodolfo Viera in mount. But yeah, very good game plan from Andre Petroski. Did exactly what he needed to do. Was able to outstrike Rodolfo Viera. In terms of Rodolfo Viera, his striking's definitely improved. If you look at him earlier on in his UFC career, when he was a bit of just a grappling merchant, he seems like his striking's definitely improved. He's actually quite hard hitting on the feet. He was landing a rip into the body a couple of times, which impressed me. And I think if he sharpens up his wrestling, I don't know how old Rodolfo Viera is. He looks quite old, might just be the steroids. I don't know how old he is, but if he sharpens up his wrestling, he could be a beast, because all he needs is good wrestling to take the fight to the mat. And then if he can take the fight to the mat, it's his oyster. He's got the jiu-jitsu. You know, the only fights where he doesn't win is where he can't take the fight to the mat. So he's a good guy. He's Rodolfo Viera, a good fighter. That's how Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys should fight. You know, you've got the likes of Ryan Hall and, you know, Kron Gracie, who just hope that you're going to go into the mount. That's not how he works. Rodolfo Viera, from a guy that's transitioned from jiu-jitsu, has a very good kind of fight IQ in the octagon. But either way, good win for Petroski. It was a decent fight. They were both doing well on the feet. Rodolfo Viera was unable to take Petroski down, and Petroski just did enough on the feet. Even shot a couple of takedowns of his own, did Petroski. Didn't, you know, fully commit with the takedowns, which I don't blame him when you're grappling with Rodolfo Viera. But good performance from Petroski, and even Rodolfo Viera didn't look too bad in that fight. So yeah, fairly solid fight there. Then we had Ismael Bonfim versus Nazim Sadykov. Not really much to take away from this fight. Ismael Bonfim looked like he was winning that first round against Sadykov, even though it wasn't like a dominant first round. And then suddenly, and in between the corners, between the first and the second round, I found out that Bonfim can't fight. Apparently, he can't see out of one of his eyes, and the fight's now over. I don't really understand what went on there. It looked like Bonfim was the one complaining to the doctors and everything that he couldn't see, rather than just trying to go on with the fight, which I didn't understand. I'm not saying he's a quitter or anything, but Sadykov ends up getting the TKO in the first round because of that, and there's not really much to say. It was a bit of a weird doctor stoppage. I was hoping to see more of this because it seemed like it was a very good first round. It was a close striking fight. Sadykov seemed to be doing better with the kicking, but Bonfim was returning as well. It would have been good to see this fight as it progressed and as they both heated up, but unfortunately, the doctor stopped the fight. There wasn't really a fight going on, and Nazim Sadykov ends up getting the TKO in the at the end of the first round. So I guess that's good for Sadykov. I'm not really sure what you do with Bonfim next. Bit of a bummer. But yeah, that's all I can really talk about, to be fair. They didn't really end up fighting. Then we had the featured fight of the card, Edmen Shahbazyan getting the knockout, a pretty brutal knockout as well, over Dylan Budka in the first round. I think Edmen Shahbazyan was one of the biggest favourites on the card, as he should have been, because why would you pick Dylan Budka in this fight, realistically? Shahbazyan gets a knockout in the first round, lands a nice 1-2 down the pipe, and then goes for the ground and pound finish against Dylan Budka. Edmen's a scary striker, man. Like, he's a scary striker. I know he used to be this massive prospect in the middleweight division, and I know he's taken a few losses here and there, but you look at who he's losing to. He's losing to some of the top middleweights on the planet, but from a striking perspective, he's so dangerous. He's got perfect timing, knows what to throw at the right time, even from his body kicks to just the 1-2 down the pipe, and the power as well. He must hit incredibly hard. I'd love to see like an Edmen Shahbazyan versus like a Joe Pyfer. I think that'd be such a good fight, and you know, there's no way that goes past the first round. So Edmen Shahbazyan, scary striker, and I think if he can, you know, change a couple things from his game here and there, it could be a genuine threat to the middleweight division, at least unranked in the middleweight division, because like I said, I know he's taken a few losses, but still a scary striker. Cut Dylan Budka. This was a bit of a layup, I'm going to say, for Edmen Shahbazyan. You've got Dylan Budka, who I think coming into this fight was like 7-4 for a professional record. Might have even been worse than that. I don't think he'd had a single win in the UFC. He couldn't even become the LFA champion after he lost to Azamat Bekaev. I know that Dylan Budka's trying to do this whole reinventing thing, becoming a whole new fighter, and this was a big step up in competition, but is he really UFC worthy? I'm not entirely convinced, so we're probably going to have to cut Dylan Budka from the UFC, but either way, good performance from Edmen Shahbazyan, back on track with another knockout win, and if he can kind of turn his career around, I want to see what he does next in the middleweight division. Then we had in the co-main event, Cavelcanti versus Youssef Zalal. Youssef Zalal, basically for the first 2 rounds, just outstrikes Cavelcanti. Cavelcanti couldn't really get going, as he hasn't really been able to. It seems like ever since that Max Holloway fight, Cavelcanti has kind of been shell-shocked. Like, I'm not saying he's looked terrible in every fight, because obviously he had that decent fight against Josh Emmett, but he just doesn't really seem to be the same since that Max Holloway fight. Youssef Zalal comes in and just outstrikes Cavelcanti. The third round was a bit all over the place. Cavelcanti was heavily pressuring Youssef Zalal, trying to look for that knockout shot, and Youssef Zalal did enough to avoid any damage. But my main takeaways is it was a great performance from Youssef Zalal, outstriking a guy in Cavelcanti. I really thought that the only way that Youssef Zalal could really win this fight is if he uses the striking to take Cavelcanti down and then maybe look for a submission from there, because we all know Youssef Zalal for being the submission heavy guy, but now that he's outstriking guys in Cavelcanti, who's known for his, you know, good boxing, that's a really good sign from Youssef Zalal. He's a very well-rounded guy, very promising career from a skills perspective. 4 wins in the UFC, 3 finishes. Well, he's actually got more than 4 wins in the UFC, but in his current run in the UFC with Youssef Zalal 2.0, he's got 4 wins. Went to a decision with Ali Tapori as well, which I guess is impressive. And I think he's a star in the making. He's a fun style, charismatic dude, good mic skills, good promotability. He's already quite a big star in himself. A lot of people are talking about him. You know, he's going on these big podcasts and everything. So he's making a name for himself. He's Youssef Zalal. And after beating Cavelcanti in a Fight Night co-main event, and he called out Brian Ortega as well, which I think is a banger of a fight. And I honestly think he beats Brian Ortega. He's going to be in the top 5 of the featherweight division in like within 12. I mean, he could be fighting for a belt within 12 months. Who knows? If he goes and beats Cavelcanti, and then you put him against like a Yair Rodrigues and he beats him too, he could be fighting for a belt very soon, could Youssef Zalal. In terms of Cavelcanti, he should have fought the entire fight like the round 3. I don't know why Cavelcanti keeps coming out with these very kind of, I don't know how to describe it, like these kind of extremely cautious approaches where he's coming out very defensively sound, like he's pressuring people, but he's not throwing anything. And you look at him earlier on in his UFC career, that just wasn't really his style, going back to what I said about him looking shell-shocked. So if he'd have fought every round, like the 3rd round, he would have had much more success. But yeah, it just seems like Cavelcanti, he hasn't really been able to keep up with the featherweight division. I say we give him somebody unranked next, maybe like a Gene Silva. I know Gene Silva's going to be fighting soon. So maybe if Gene Silva wins his next fight, we'll do Gene Silva versus Cavelcanti. Whilst Youssef Zalal Put him on a pay-per-view main card against Brian Ortega. Maybe you do it in like Mexico later this year if they go back to Mexico for a pay-per-view. I'm not sure, but solid win from Youssef Zalal. Star in the making. Solid performance. There were people booing as well. After they announced Youssef Zalal's the winner, there was a bunch of people booing. I think they were just Cavelcanti's team, but if they weren't Cavelcanti's team, I don't know what the hell they were booing for, because that was clearly a win to Youssef Zalal. You can't even really score that third round for Cavelcanti, because yes, he was, you know, trying to go for the win more, but he didn't land anything significant in the third round anyway. So good win from Youssef Zalal, star in the making. And then we had the main event with Cannonier TKOing, or not even TKOing, but just pretty much straight up knocking out Gregory Rodrigues in the fourth round, right at the beginning of the fourth round, to get a good stoppage win and get back on track in the winning column after suffering 2 defeats. Yeah, what a fight this was. I think we all knew that if Gregory Rodrigues was going to win this fight, it was going to be like an early barrage. I know when I was predicting the fight, I said for some reason that Cannonier might win early and then the tides might change. If anything, the opposite happened. So this was just a really good fight. You knew it could end at any moment. 2 hard-hitting middleweights going at it. And by the way, Gregory Rodrigues looks huge for the middleweight division. This guy looks absolutely massive. He looks like a light heavyweight, and he's going against Cannonier, who's a former heavyweight. The guy looks huge for this division. Rodrigues is dangerous. He's like a Sergey Pavlovich kind of. He's this long, rangy, hard-hitting middleweight. But you take one look at his physique and you can already tell he's not going to make it past 2 rounds. He's way too muscular, way too bulky, way too explosive to go 5 rounds, in my opinion. And similar to like when Michel Pereira fought Anthony Hernandez last year. So he's a very dangerous 1-round fighter as Gregory Rodrigues. But you put him in a 5-rounder, I don't like his odds. Even though I did pick him to win, I think by a 3rd-round TKO. And for Cannonier, this guy still has it, man. I know he's, what, 41 years old now, but he's still got it, I'm telling you. He's not a top contender. I know he's been finished by Imavov, destroyed by Caio Bravo. Adesanya pieced him up as well, and he arguably lost to Strickland. I don't really know what you can do next with Cannonier, though, because I don't think he should retire, because he's, like I said, he just finished Gregory Rodrigues, this big middleweight prospect. So I don't think we can really say he needs to retire. But he's fought nearly everybody ranked above him. Like I said, he's fought Strickland, he's fought Imavov, he's fought Barallo, he's fought Adesanya, he's fought Whittaker. Who do you give him next? I'm not sure. Maybe you run it back with like a Sean Strickland, or maybe you let another up-and-comer get their chance against Cannonier. I'm not sure what you do against him. But if we're going to see Cannonier every now and then in a Fight Night main event in the Apex, I don't mind it, because the past couple of ones we've been having with Cannonier has just been pure bangers. Him versus Barallo, Rodrigues, Imavov, Vittori, they've all been bangers of fights, so I can't complain about Cannonier. He's a bit of a gatekeeper now in the middleweight division, but at least he's a fun gatekeeper. I don't think he's going to go on a title run or anything like that. And for Gregory Rodrigues, I think he needs to lose a bit of muscle. Don't get me wrong, very explosive, very dangerous guy, but the guy is not built for 5 rounds. He's built for 3 rounds. It isn't like he gassed after the first round or anything like that. It isn't like he was completely done after the first, but he's not built for 5 rounds. He needs to improve his stamina, maybe lose a bit of muscle. And I'd love to see him as like a Joe Pyfer or something next. But that's my main breakdown of UFC Vegas 102. Like I said before, it was a solid Apex card. Wasn't one of the best fight nights you're ever going to see. But for an Apex card, did everything it had to, well, gave everything it had to give. Pretty solid card. And yeah, let me know